insert the data about that. I just wanted to confirm like something that I want to like. I need the database to fail so that I can confirm that the error that's going to be returned.
Did we ever fix the audio issue that was happening at the beginning?
I just talked really loudly into the microphone on the computer.
But we got confirmation they could hear you? Okay. Because I don't think your computer's mic was at the screen, but maybe it's just because you disconnected. Maybe that's why I didn't see it. Whatever. Test. All right.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. The summer is so much.
I've learned that lesson. Yeah.
Yeah, still.
Are you ready?
We messed around with this. Gradle. So I was trying to put something and then gave out this. The thing I think is trying to go through the same I heard like earlier, like something say like this, and they're like,
One of the projects I went through.
There we go.
Yeah. Let me see that.
Yeah, that's crazy. Like, I think
Okay, I'm going to get started here in a second. You can make your way back to your seats, please. Okay.
where they expose the fault.
And whoever was talking to the people who are on the stream, if you could get confirmation that can hear me, that would be good. I don't know who that was. All right, well, I'll just get started. Let me know if you hear that. If they can't hear me, then let me know. I think I'm broadcasting. Okay, hi, I'm John. This is going to be pretty quick, but just want to give a quick rundown of where Kotlin is at in 2022. I mean, I could have gone all the way back to 2019, but that was a little bit too much. So where is it at right now? What's been happening recently? First, a little bit about me if you don't know me. I work at Grubhub. I'm also one of the co-organizers of CKUG. You can find me online on various social medias and GitHub. Yeah, so I work at Grubhub. We do have roles open, fully remote and hybrid roles. We have some perks that I put here that I think are some of our better perks. If you're interested, come talk to me. I can tell you about what we've got going on. But enough about me. Well, one more thing about me. I am on the platform engineering team at Grubhub, which is responsible for our runtime framework on the JVM, as well as all our build tooling, test tooling, everything for that in the JVM space. So that's kind of what I work on. So if you're interested in that, come talk to me. All right. Enough about me. How about you? Okay, we already talked about who was the first person, or your first time at CKUG. Well, let's do it again because I think we had some people come in late. So raise your hand if this is your first time at CKUG. All right. That is, love to see it. This is our first time back. So I'm glad that we're able to reach some new people. How many of you out there are primarily doing Android development with Kotlin? All right, wow. Okay, so this is very unique, and I think I was wondering if it was going to hold true post-pandemic. But out of all the other people that I know that run Kotlin user groups and things like that in other cities that I've talked to, we by far have the least % of Android developers in our group. So, I mean, I think that means there's exciting things happening on the server side space in Kotlin here in Chicago. So I was interested to see that. But yeah, raise your hand if you're using Kotlin on the back end. All right. All right, awesome. Raise your hand if you're using Kotlin somewhere else that I did not mention. All right. Where? Where? Native? Doing Kotlin native? Targeting what platform? Linux. All right, cool. Very cool. Let's talk later. Okay. All right, so first, I'm going to kind of talk about what's new in Kotlin. Here's a brief overview. I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about context receivers. That's the big one. Definitely non-nullable types, data objects, generic inline classes. Then from language features, we'll move on to talking about some of the compiler improvements that are going on, and then a little bit about adoption. So first, let's start with context receivers. This is a big one. It's a pretty big addition to the language, and it's also controversial. But real quick, before I move on to that, I did want to say if some of these things sound obscure or weird, it's because they are. And actually, this is not a full list of everything that's new in Kotlin, but so many of them are like so niche that like the description of what they are would not fit on my screen. Like even in the release notes, the title is like this long because Kotlin is mature. It has like all the things you basically need, and now we're just getting down into like the nitty gritty little improvements here and there to enable certain types of code to work and things like that. At least that's my takeaway. But context receivers is a big one. It was introduced in 1.6.20. So what context receivers are is you can think of them also as implicit parameters. So the parameters to your function or class that don't have to be passed in through the signature, but you have access to them within your function. But you have access to them in scope, like this, right? So it's not like there's not like a name that you access. It's just like this. So you can also think of it kind of like an extension function with receiver, if you're familiar with those. But with an extension function with a receiver, you can only have one receiver. With context receivers, you can have multiple. You have as many as you want. So let's look at what this looks like. Okay. So at the top here, we have an interface. I'm going to walk you through this code. Don't worry. Called logging context. That's our context. Now it doesn't have to be an interface. It could be a class. Either one works. So in this example, we want to have a logger in our contexts, say. So like these context receivers are good for like kind of cross-cutting concerns, like such as, I wouldn't do it for logging like this example, but this is the example the release notes had in, so I just went with it, okay? So once you have that declared, the next thing you do is you declare a function where you want to have that context in scope. And you do that with the little context keyword above it. There's a new keyword, that's why my syntax highlighter can't recognize it here. But the context keyword, you put the type inside the parentheses, and that says this function will be called within the context of a logging context. It can only be called in that scenario then. So now we have access to log. You can see in my function, I can just call log.info and just call it like I would, like it was a private member. So now when you look at the test function at the bottom, the only way we can invoke start business operation is if we wrap it in a with logging context scope there. So you still are responsible for creating that logging context somewhere, right? And then calling with it. But once you do that, then any code within that block will have access to that context, including like all the way down the call stack. So if this looks kind of familiar, it might, if you've dealt with structured concurrency and coroutines, right? It works very similar to this. But basically, the idea of context receivers in the language is exposing that structure to just, you can build your own contexts. It's not just coroutine scope anymore. So that's what that is. Questions about context receivers before I move on, before you forget what they are? Yes.
Does it get more useful than this? Because here you probably could have just like passed, right? Like passed that.
So yes, the question is, do they get more useful than this? And yeah, like for logging, I would not do this. Like I said, I would use like an extension property or something like that. This is the way I usually do logging. But yeah, so for logging is not the best use case. I see it commonly used for like database stuff. Like where you have like a database connection, you want to interact with your driver, like, and like not have to pass it all the way around everywhere, stuff like that. But honestly, like I said, this is a controversial one because, a functional programming purist might not like this, right? Because like a function should take parameters and return its result and not have this weird kind of like, I mean, this is reminiscent of like AOP, at least to me, aspect-oriented programming. It's like taking care of cross-cutting concerns in an implicit way. So some people like this, some people really don't. So don't just start using it willy-nilly. Talk to your team or whoever else is working on your code. But it is a little bit also, I'll get to your question in 1 second. It is also a little bit, I wanted to mention, kind of like a trait, if you're familiar with traits in like Scala, for example. It's kind of like that, but it's not exactly the same. And actually just yesterday, Roman in the Kotlin Slack had a whole thread where he was talking about the differences between this and a trait. And you can go read that if you want to. But it is a little bit like a trait. Yes, another question?
From the FT perspective too, I was going to say, I think I like it from an FT perspective because it starts to approach outbreak effects to some degree. Like it's still just like an ergonomic way of doing it, like you could just inject it in, but it starts to resemble like tracking effects at the type level.
Yeah. So the comment was an argument for, well, this, from a functional programming perspective, this is actually pretty good because it starts looking like, would you say, algebraic effects?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and it does look like some of the stuff that you can do in like, I don't know, Haskell and stuff. For me, I like functional programming, but I'm also a functional programming dummy, and I don't really understand that stuff to be fully straightforward with it. So to me, it's confusing, but that's me. Like this is like a personal thing, and I think that the people who are really hardcore into functional programming, like the Scala people, the Haskell people, maybe the Arrow people, whatever, I think this does actually cater towards. I think this is something they were asking for. So I didn't mean to say that it's not a functional programming concept, but I just meant at that very base, noob level of functional programming where I operate, it does seem weird. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so definitely non-nullable types. Like this is definitely not null. What does that mean? It's a really weird wording of a feature. So let's talk about what it is though. Again, this was a 1.6.20 feature. This allows you to declare a generic type as not nullable. So it's really useful in Java interop when you're dealing with platform types for like generic methods and things like that coming in from your Java code, where it's just a platform type, right? So it's nullable. And you want to guard against that in your generic interoperability with the generics there. And it uses an interesting construct called type intersection, which is new to Kotlin. So I'll show you what that looks like. So consider this function here. I called it Elvis-like, but basically it's like a function that basically does what the Elvis operator does. You can see here I'm assigning it to basically an invocation of the Elvis operator. Okay, so it's basically take X, take Y. If X is not null, return X. Otherwise, return Y. Okay, so the problem with this, if I wanted to declare my own Elvis operator like this, there's a problem here, right? Because T is nullable. All right, it can be any type, right, including nullable types. So if you look at my invocation there, where I pass null as the Y parameter, well, that makes no sense, right? Because if you're doing an Elvis operator, that second argument has to be non-nullable, because that's the point. It's the fallback in case X is null, right? So this is no good, right? So one way you might fix this is this, right? You might think, okay, well, I can make T extend any. That's not any with a question mark, so it's not a nullable any. It's just any. So that means T is not nullable. Great, except for now Elvis doesn't do what we want it to do, right? Because what if we pass a nullable string in as the X? Now we're going to get a compiler error on that S because we can't pass nullable types in. And we want X to be nullable in this case of doing an Elvis operator, right? So that's not going to work either. So here's how we can do it. This is the definitely non-nullable type. It's the part where Y is defined as a T and any. That's the part. So that allows us to say, well, the generic type of this function is T, but the Y parameter is actually both a T and an any, a non-nullable any. So that's the intersection type right there. It's saying Y is descends from both of these types. Now this and operator here, this ampersand, which is the intersection, is only able to be done like this, basically, in Kotlin. It is limited right now to a nullable type on the left and a non-nullable any on the right. That is the only way you can do intersections right now. Maybe that syntax will open up later in Kotlin and be used for other stuff, but for now, that's the only case for it. But now you can see if in this function call I have here, if I call Elvis-like with a nullable string for X and a null for Y, I will get a compile error on the null part. You can't see that here, but just trust me. It would be a compile error on the null because you can't pass a nullable thing in for the Y parameter. Questions about that before we go on? All right, move on. Moving on, data objects. These are in 1.7.20. It's like a data class, but for objects. This is pretty straightforward. But it's good to point out that they're really good in sealed class hierarchies, where you might have a bunch of data classes in your sealed class hierarchy, and you want to treat all of those different types the same. For example, maybe printing them, putting them in hash maps, whatever you want to do. So you might want the data keyword on there. So here's an example. Say we're reading data from a file, and it can result in a few different things. It could be a number, it could be text, it could be the end of file marker. An end of file marker is, there's only one of them. It's a special byte, right, or whatever in your file. So it doesn't need to be a class, it can just be an object. It's a singleton. So in this case, we can now put data in front of that object, and now we can treat it the same. Like we can do print line on it, and it will be called nice toString. We'll see like end of file there instead of like the generic object, like .toString output that you would get. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Any questions on that?
The benefit here is really just for toString methods, basically.
ToString, I mean, I guess if you were taking a read result and putting it as a key to a hash map, now you get your hash code. I guess, I mean, so I don't, I think there's other things you could do with it. Anything that, like, if you want to be able to treat any read result the same, then like you want to have a data object. Mm-hmm.
Do you know how this works? Does it have like a copy method on it? It doesn't make a lot of sense for an object, and I feel like my most common use case when running in with objects and data classes and field classes when you have to prove it's a data class, so you can use that copy to update it.
I haven't looked at what the copy function does. I mean, it gets one. I don't know what the actual implementation of that copy is. Yeah, I would hope it is the same instance that it returns, but that's a good question.
I think the data object doesn't have the call.
The data object just doesn't have one? Oh, okay. Apparently it does not have one. Okay. So a special case there. Cool. That makes sense. Generic inline classes. This is another 1.7.20 feature. So inline classes can now be generic. That might sound esoteric, so let's just like look at it. So if you have a value class, also known as inline class, inline classes are kind of used as like, say you have some data, right? And like, for example, a user ID, and that's generally some kind of like string data usually, right? You have an ID and it's a string, but you want to make your API more type safe, right? So you don't want to be able to just pass any string in to a user ID parameter. You want to wrap it as a user ID type, then only things that are actually user ID type can be passed in as that parameter. So it kind of gives you some type safety in your API, right? That's the general use case for inline classes. But what if, for some reason in your system, there are multiple types of user IDs? Some of them are represented by strings, and some of them are maybe represented by a UUID. Okay, this is a contrived example I came up with, but there's one I could think of when I saw this feature. So you actually have multiple different implementations of a user ID type. You can parameterize your user ID and have it take a value of type T. And then, for example, if we have like a print ID function, you could take both different types. And the implementation is a little different because if you want to get the string out of the UID, you want to call .toString. Whereas if it's a string, you can just print the string, right? And if you look at the bottom in the test, we can have user IDs of different types and then pass them into print ID, if that makes sense. Any questions on this? This is a very contrived example. So I understand if it's confusing. But yeah, basically inline classes can have a generic type. All right, let's talk compiler improvements. I'm no compiler expert. I don't understand most of the stuff I read when I see about compilers. I'll be upfront about that. But some of the things that I saw in the notes that stuck out to me is that they've came up with a whole new way of doing incremental compilation in Gradle. So hopefully you see your builds faster there when you're using the newer versions of Kotlin that has that new incremental compilation. They have added a new type of parallel compilation in the IR JVM compiler backend, which lets you compile a single module in parallel. So it used to be that like each module would could be run in parallel, but now even within one module, multiple compilation units can be run in parallel. So that should also speed up the compilation there for the IR backend. But there's always the future. There's the K2 backend that they're still working on. They've added a bunch of features to it. It supports a lot more stuff, but it's still in alpha. So sure, if you like compilers, go play around with that, but it's nowhere near ready for production yet. But there is progress being made there. So hopefully they keep pushing forward on that. I will not be taking questions on this because I don't know anything more than what's on this slide. Okay, so let's talk about adoption. I think this is a really big story for 2022. So Kotlin continues to be dominant in the Android space. Actually, according to Google, 95% of apps in the Google Play App Store have Kotlin in them, which is huge. I mean, that's huge, right? You can't understate that. So a lot of this Google information I'm talking about comes from a specific talk from Devox that they gave. And if you haven't seen that talk, go look it up because there's some really cool stuff in there. But they announced that Kotlin is a first-class backend Java JVM language internally at Google. They have like something like 11 million lines of Kotlin code in their mono repo. But basically, they talk a lot about how they worked to make it as well supported as Java, and Java was a big language for them. And they're encouraging teams to use Kotlin. They're not forcing teams to use Kotlin. It's up to the team, the free to mix and match and everything like that. But they definitely gave a strong indicator that they are behind Kotlin on the back end, and they are doing it, and they're doing a lot of it. So, you know, it's not as strong of a signal as what they did with Android because, you know, they don't own the platform of just back end like they do Android. But they are giving definitely a strong signal that that's the direction they're going. They also did a very interesting study about mixing code. So these are actual formal studies they did within their organization. And I think it's really cool because only an organization as big as something like a Google or an IBM or whatever are big enough to really do these studies like well. They found that mixing ecosystems, and in their example is Java and C++, adds significant overhead to the development process. So just learning overhead, tooling overhead, mistakes, ramp up, all that stuff. But mixing languages within a single ecosystem, and in their example, it was Java plus Kotlin, does not have those drawbacks. So they basically saw zero friction in mixing languages on the JVM. So for people who might be, if you're in your organization, you're wanting to do Kotlin, and people are pushing back like, well, we don't want to add extra stuff to our stack, want to stay streamlined. This is a really compelling argument for why adding Kotlin to your Java stack is not the same as adding Rust to your Java stack. Okay, not that I love Rust and everything, but I'm just saying, right? Or Go or anything else. Like, it really does make a difference that they're in the same ecosystem and can use a lot of the same tooling. That makes a much bigger difference than maybe a lot of people assume. So that was very interesting. Finally, the Spring and Gradle organizations continue to promote Kotlin as a preferred language. Like, for example, on the Gradle, official Gradle documentation, for a while now, they've had all their code examples in Kotlin and Groovy, but they switched the tabs. Kotlin's first now. Just these little things maybe I noticed, but that trend is continuing. More and more people are saying that Kotlin is the future. So I thought it was good to highlight. I really do think Kotlin on the back end is very much here. A lot of people still don't know it exists. I'll talk to a lot of people and they go, oh, you do Kotlin stuff, you must do Android then. Like, get that all the time still. But it really is building, and I think that's exciting to see. All right, that's all I had. Like I said, it was going to be short. My slides, if you wanted to refer to them, are at this URL. And again, I'm on social media or whatever. You can hit me up there. Thank you. And yeah, Amanda, you can come up. But yeah, I think we'll hang around for a little bit more and chat and about more stuff. But thank you everyone for coming out. It's really great to see everyone here. Super excited to do more of these. Like, I think this was a really good turnout for the fact that, like, considering the fact we haven't seen each other in a long time, So great. Let's keep doing this.
Yeah.
Right,
Oh my God, great talk, John. I was like in the middle of quoting now. Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming. Just a heads up, there is one virtual streaming event that's going to be December 10th within Android GDE, so don't miss out